Hello, CASW members, ABSW members, participants, anyone who may be joining us, wherever you are, wherever you're at. I see that we have some folks from Canada, some folks who are international. So welcome. Thank you so much for taking another hour of your day to join us. I am so thrilled to be here today. My name is Alexandra Zanis. I am the Social Policy and Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. I'm just going to run through a very brief couple quick housekeeping notes, and then I'm going to pass it on so that we can get into the bulk of the presentation. As an FYI, I think you may have already found the chat button. If you haven't, those blue and white icons or widgets at the bottom will hopefully get you everything you need. If you're looking for the chat or the Q&A tab, you can use that for questions dedicated to the presentation, or the chat tab if you just want to talk about the presentation. Either or works, and we'll be monitoring both. The handout section gives you some more details about the book, a very special promotional code for if you want to purchase the text, which I would highly recommend, as well as just a couple other things I wanted to flag as well. There is a Twitter function, so feel free to tweet about this event with the hashtag Africentric Social Work, because I would love to see more people getting engaged on our social medias about this amazing offering. I believe that's it. I am on the back end today, so feel free to use that Q&A tab if you need to get in touch about tech questions or anything else, or else enjoy the presentation. I am joined by Dr. Mullins from the Association of Black Social Workers. I'm going to pass it over. Dr. Mullins, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Alexandra. Hello, everybody, and as Alexandra says, welcome. Thank you for attending this launch of the launching of the Africentric Social Work edited book. We want to thank the CASW and ABSW for partnering with us to bring this webinar to you. We especially want to thank ABSW, the only known Black social work association in Canada, for spearheading this work, without whose efforts this book would not come to fruition. When you get the book, you will see that there are many people to thank. However, I'm just going to mention that there are many people to thank. And when you get it, you can take a look inside and see the many people that helped us along our journey. Our fearless editorial team consists of Dr. Thomas Bernard, Dr. Est, Dr. Clark, and Dr. Giwa, and of course myself. And unfortunately, the latter two are not here with us today. But before we go any further, I offer the following. First, Memorial University's land acknowledgement, which says the land acknowledgement is offered to recognize Indigenous peoples' enduring connection to their traditional territories, to recognize the history of the land, and to concurrently the land that is concurrently shared by many people, and to recognize stewardship as a shared commitment of all those who reside in the territory. The practice of territory acknowledgement is itself a replication of an Indigenous practice which predates European contact. Because I reside on the St. John's campus, I will say we respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the islands of Newfoundland, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut, and the Innu of Nitissina, and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing, truth, reconciliation, and honor this beautiful land together. We are actively in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. We, the book editors specifically, are actively in solidarity with Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and mourn the loss of children who left their communities for residential schools, never returned home, and now are confirmed deceased. With their families and communities, we call for full reconciliation. And secondly, I would like to acknowledge the existence of the transatlantic slave trade. So we want to acknowledge the histories, legacies, and consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, of which Canada participated. Our ancestors' blood colors the ocean and the earth, which provide us life resources and sustenance. Their blood, sweat, tears, and toil built nation states and continue to generate wealth through colonial white supremacist capitalistic regimes. Their hopes, dreams, and aspirations are heard through the gentle breeze and the howling winds lodged in the universe and reverberate throughout all times. So we see their reflections in multi-generational families in Canada, such as those in African Nova Scotian communities. And our ancestral blood memory guided this conversation that we had throughout the life of the book project, and you'll see that it will guide this conversation today. Our ancestors' memories and spirits are present here with us today, and we'd like to honor them as well and share with you pieces of how we were able to climb on their backs to bring this book to fruition. So without further ado, I will ask Sadia Williams, who is the outreach worker for the social work, for the Association of Black Social Workers, who obtained her BSW and MSW from Dalhousie University and is a certified career development practitioner with Nova Scotia Career Center Development Association. She has over 20 years of experience in client care specialization and care management. She will bring you greetings from the ABSW.
Thank you very much, Dolores. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me fine? Okay, just wanted to be sure. On behalf of the Association of Black Social Workers, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here this afternoon for this very exciting book launch. I'm just going to give you a little brief overview of the Association of Black Social Workers, which we refer to as ABSW. The Association of Black Social Workers was first formed by a group of social workers in Montreal in 1977. Following their attendance at the United States-based National Association of Black Social Workers Conference. Within Montreal, the nucleus kept the momentum for 2 years. However, they were unable to sustain the group beyond 1979. As the group was winding down, a former social worker intern was returning to her native home of Nova Scotia, and the return of Maxine Prevost-Shepard, with permission from the NABSW to transfer their organizational charter, helped from the Nova Scotia group in 1979. The Nova Scotia Association of Black Social Workers was formed by 4 women, Maxine Prevost-Shepard, Frances Mills Clemens, Althea Tolliver, and the Honorable Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. These 4 women were all community-minded, socially conscious, and politically astute, and shared a common vision of changing the ways in which social services were being delivered to Black Nova Scotians. The vision of these 4 women was to transform the capacity of the delivery of social services through the introduction of multilateral mechanisms which would enable social agencies to become responsive to the plight of Black families and communities. The idea for this book emerged at the 35th anniversary conference of the Association of Black Social Workers entitled Moving Forward, Pathways to Culturally Competent Practice with Peoples of African Descent, which ran from September 25th to 27th in 2014. The attendees included educators, healthcare workers, and social workers, featuring conference topics such as racism, justice, child welfare, mental health and addictions, and intimate partner violence. 3 of the editors of this text, Mullins, Est, and Bernard, were all present at the event that led to the creation of this book. The Nova Scotia Association of Black Social Workers is now in its 42nd year and has been using Africentric theory and practice since its inception. Past, present, and future ABSW initiatives are rooted in Africentric theory and practice. We congratulate the editors and each of the authors who have made contributions to this essential text. Your work makes a substantial contribution to the field and clearly brings Africentric social work from the margins to the center of social work theory and practice in Canada. And also, we'd like to thank the Canadian Association of Social Workers for co-hosting this virtual book launch with us this afternoon. Thank you.
So now we will introduce you to the members of the panel individually as they speak, and everyone on the panel is a contributor in the book. And we, as you'll see, we have community members. We had people that were students when the book was still before print, and academics, of course. So we're happy to be able to showcase some of the different members that contributed to the book. So I'll start with someone that really, I don't even know why I have an introduction for her, because probably most of you on here could introduce her yourself. However, out of respect, I will say please welcome Dr. Thomas Bernard, who is a Canadian senator. We're very proud of that, and her too, and her work. She was formerly a social worker. She still is. I don't know why she says formerly. She still is a social worker and social work educator from East Preston, Nova Scotia. Dr. Thomas Bernard is the first Black Canadian to have an academic tenure position and become a full professor at Dalhousie University. Her research focuses on anti-oppression and diversity. Please welcome Dr. Thomas Bernard.
Thank you, Dr. Mullins. And let me start by saying, again, congratulations to each author, each contributor, and to the editorial team. So we've been asked to share briefly from the book. I want to hold it up. I have a hard copy of it. I'm going to just share a few of the highlights from the foreword that was written by the ABSW executive. As members of the executive of the Nova Scotia Association of Black Social Workers, we are pleased and excited to participate in the Africentric Social Work book project. In this foreword, we share with you our early beginnings, struggles, challenges, and achievements in our fight for Black lives, Black liberation, and freedom in Nova Scotia and across Canada. Our fights took place in boardrooms, political offices, community organizations, government agencies, healthcare institutions, and in the streets. The reality of systemic racism forced us to hold our meetings at our kitchen tables in our family homes in the early years. Over time, we were able to partner with organizations that gave us space in kind. And eventually, we were able to obtain funding to acquire office space to conduct the business of our association. The ABSW builds on a solid foundation of African-centered theory and practice to influence social work in Canada, and this forms the nucleus of this book. Partnerships, innovation, and creative interventions are hallmarks of this organization, from student placements to strategic partnerships with community-based organizations and government departments. The ABSW have been able to develop programs and services in communities that drive change. Most recently, the ABSW was on the front lines to assist communities in dealing with COVID-19. When the government of Nova Scotia declared a provincial state of emergency to help contain the spread of COVID-19 on March 22nd, 2020, the ABSW provided leadership to support the African Nova Scotian community in dealing with the pandemic. This Afrocentric text provides social work educators and students with a rich educational and practice tool to help them better understand the challenges faced by African Canadians and to develop awareness of best practices to address them. At this time in the evolution of the ABSW, we are experiencing tremendous growth and development, and this text will support our efforts. As we go forward, we firmly believe that this text will help to move Afrocentric theory from obscurity and the margins of social work, of the social work profession, to the center of social work practice, research, and policy development in Canada. To conclude, this book can serve as the foundation for education on this topic for undergraduate students and field practitioners to support their growth, development, and preparation to provide equitable and accessible Afrocentric services to African Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Bernard Thomas. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. David Est, who is an adjunct professor and professor emeritus with the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. And Dr. Est didn't put anything else on here because we asked him for one sentence, but I want to tell you that, in the latter stages of the book, this workhorse was on a hospital bed editing some of this. So, it just speaks to some of the work that carried on this project. We just worked no matter what. So please, Dr. Est, welcome. And let's hear some of your words from your chapter.
Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Mullins. And I want to acknowledge my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Bernard, and my two other co-editors, Dr. Gia and Dr. Clark. I said to one of my colleagues last week that when they found out this book was published, and I said it started out as a dream, and then it became a vision, and here's the product. So, and I'd like to thank Dr. Mullins for acknowledging my situation, because a lot of my friends thought I was crazy because I was in the hospital for about 5 months. And yes, I actually did some editing on my hospital bed. So I'm going to read a couple pieces from chapter 3 entitled Social Work Pioneers. And this chapter was a result of a project that we did with Dr. Chris Walmsley, Dr. Bernard, and myself. And in thinking about the project, we didn't receive any funding. So we operated from a shoestring budget. But we felt it was important because the content of this chapter doesn't exist anywhere in terms of any Canadian social work literature. And as I mentioned, the chapter is entitled Social Work Pioneers. Little is known about the first groups of African Canadian social workers and the contributions these professionally educated individuals made to their communities and the social work profession. This chapter is based on interviews, biographies, and personal papers of 15 African Canadian social work pioneers and shows the challenges they face, their strategies for change they integrated, their thinking about the times in which they live, and their contributions to both professional and community life. We argue that in spite of Canada's history of slavery, oppression, and anti-Black racism, several individuals in the 1950s and 1960s overcame these barriers to become professional social work. Although they did not have Black social work professionals or professors as mentors, they emerged as leaders in fields as diverse as mental health, prison reform, community development, nonprofit administration, human rights, and Canadian politics. While some pioneers have been recognized publicly for their contributions, others are best remembered by their friends, family, and those whose life they changed for the better. I'm just going to describe a little bit about the pioneers who participated. The 15 Africentric social work pioneers discussed in this chapters were born before 1950 and were over 65 when interviews for this study were conducted. Each had a social work education and paid professional social work experience. 6 pioneers were female and 9 were male. Of the 11 interviewed, 5 were from British Columbia, 2 from Alberta, and 4 were from Nova Scotia. Biographical materials were available for a further 3 who were deceased: Rosemary Brown, Calvin Ruck, and Emery Barnes. In 2 cases, a long biography, Ruck 2014, and an autobiography, Brown 1989, were available for analysis. In the 3rd case, Emery Barnes' publicly available internet documents were reviewed, and an additional 2 interviews were conducted with a family member or friend of a deceased pioneer. Secondary sources such as news clippings, reports, and speeches were also consulted. The stories of these ASW pioneers were constructed by life stage, childhood, youth, leaving home, employment, entering social work education, and entering social work practice to identify similarities and differences, significant life experiences, as well as the barriers and challenges faced due to race at different stages and sources of support were identified. Strategies developed to surmount barriers and challenges were summarized. 12 of the interviewed pioneers are referred to by African pseudonyms in the text, and the 3 public figures are named as themselves. And so thank you for this opportunity for allowing me to share from this chapter and from this book. And in closing, I want to acknowledge the leadership of Dr. Mullins and Dr. Clark, because they took over from Dr. Bernard and myself, and it was their drive, it was their dedication, it was their persistence, and their high expectations. And this is a book that I am exceedingly proud to be part of. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Dr. Est. Well, we don't know much about social work pioneers, but here is the beginnings of a great relationship. Our next speaker is Dr. Laurie Chambers, who is the co-writer and co-producer of Because She Cares, a participatory art project that uses poetry and performance to generate and share knowledge and HIV service employment. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Facta Nwishta School of Social Work at the University of Toronto. And Laura is going to talk about a unique type of research that often we don't see, Black people showing up in social work research in particular ways, in certain ways. And so Laurie has shed a beautiful light on what social work research can actually look like for everybody. I mean, Dr. Chambers.
That's okay. Thank you, Dr. Mullins. I especially want to thank everyone who edited this book, and Dr. Est for recommending me from a colleague that he works with at his school, and also Dr. Mullins, who I'm a huge fan of her work at decolonizing work, and Dr. Bernard and Dr. Clark as well. I'm going to share with you the intro because I know there's a lot of social workers here who might not be as familiar with decolonizing social work research from the perspective of people of African descent. So I thought I'd share you a little bit of an intro, but if you want to know more about Because She Cares, feel free to visit our website or to actually read about it in the book. Decolonizing social work demands that the research we use or produce critically deconstructs colonial power relations. Paul A.J. wrote, "If knowledge is power, then decolonizing research is also a process of challenging the dominant power." Decolonizing social work should help social workers think about who is producing research, about the social location of the researcher, research participants, research audience, and how their social locations influence the research. This kind of reflection should trouble what we consider to be valid social work scholarship, the theories we use, methods we employ, and the evidence we seek. Danny Nuberdere offered a Kingandi or Ugandan proverb that I believe should be central to decolonizing social work. Magezi si gumo, which translates to knowledge or wisdom is not a monopoly of any individual. So decolonizing social work research does not aim to create another version of dominant power. Instead of, it moves towards multi-centeredness. People's local knowledges and knowing practices are given centrality, and other perspectives are integrated based on their alignment with local worldviews. Recently, many of us social workers who identify as people of African descent, including myself, have been pushing our colleagues to think about research methodologies and methods that are used in social work, or what I also call knowing practices and ways of knowing. These reflections include acknowledging the influence of colonization in our research practices. And social workers need to be mindful of how those colonial relations can be articulated in the research that makes up the field's knowledge base. And this mindfulness includes being aware of the use of language, the perpetuation of stereotypes, and the treatment of participants as objects under study. And many social workers of African descent, including myself, have begun to conduct research that embodies Africentric social work practice, or what I call Africentric research. This research responds politically, respectively, and safely to the cultural influences of colonization and their impacts on people of African descent. It acknowledges that research has historically played a role in silencing us as people of African descent, particularly as knowledge producers. And Africentric research responds to the local concerns of us people of African descent and reflects their understandings. And using the principles of sagacity, Africentric research should draw on our sage or insightful wisdom. And Afrocentric research uses methods that respond to the ways of people of African descent make meaning of their lives, that are grounded in their local cultural practices. For example, research that derives from Afrocentric culture institutions, for instance, Because You Care draws from spoken word and poetry. And looking at these practices and these institutions can subvert the ways in which knowledge systems, cultures, histories, and identities of people of African descent have been devalued, and can help our social communion and collective consciousness to grow. And Afrocentric research as decolonizing social work practice puts us, knowers of African descent, at the forefront, and it recognizes that research for people of African descent should be with and by them as well. I want to thank you for having me, and I also want to acknowledge the activists, the HIV activists, particularly the women who I work with, who helped bring this project and me becoming a decolonizing knower into fruition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chambers. So I'd like to introduce you now to Dorette Phillips, who is an MSW RSW and a Jamaican Canadian registered social worker who practices from a critical feminism, anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and anti-colonialism framework. She has extensive work experience in child welfare, violence against women sector, and providing therapeutic support to parents and children. She has also worked in the infant, children, and adult mental health sector. So Doris we're so happy. We were so honored to have her on this book project because, you know, as academics, even when we're in the community, we really need to have community voices. And Doris is one of those community voices that was able to bring something to the book that, you know, only she could bring with her wealth of experience. So please welcome Doris. Welcome, Doris.
Thank you, Professor Chambers. Can you guys hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
My camera is not working for whatever reason. It decided not to cooperate this afternoon, but the work continues. So good afternoon, everyone. Congratulations to the editors for the launch of this very timely book. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me to the launch. At this present moment, we are bearing witness to certain vile truths. And this is manifested in the uncovering of the remains of Indigenous children. So it will take all of us to stand up in solidarity with our First Nation brothers and sisters to advance the right for fair, equitable treatment and the right to self-govern. I acknowledge the land by recognizing the original peoples of this territory, the Mississaugas of New Credit, Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. So I'll be speaking this afternoon on the developing of an African-centric social work framework for child welfare. The development of an Afrocentric social work ASW practice framework for Ontario child welfare is guided by the theoretical lens of anti-Black racism and Afrocentric theory discussed earlier in our paper. ASW practice is grounded in the historical and contemporary experience of systemic anti-Black racism, which brings a disproportionate number of Black children and youth to the attention of child welfare authorities. It begins from the standpoint that the current child welfare system emerged out of a vile history of colonization and genocide of Indigenous peoples and is a contemporary metamorphosis of slavery for many Black families and communities. As such, ASW practice is required to get at structural inequalities in society and the root causes of existing vulnerabilities to address the pressing issues facing Black families and communities. It draws on the dialectical nature of anti-Black racism theory and Afrocentric theory to address the systemic anti-Black racism inherent in the child welfare system and to better meet the needs of Black families and communities, eliminate disparities and disproportionality, improve outcomes for Black children and youth, and ensure that Black people are treated equitably. The child welfare system continues the legacy of colonialism, white supremacy, and anti-Black racism that apprehends Black children, commodifies Black bodies, and rip Black families apart. Much like slavery, Black family preservation and reunification are not the hallmarks of the current child welfare system. Instead, the 5 pathways that we discuss in our article demonizes Black mothers, which recalls the social construction of Black women slaves as subhuman, inferior, beasts of burden, who are denied the rights of motherhood and the dignity of mothering their children, which was accorded to white women. Davis, 1983, and Roberts, 2002. An ASW framework, therefore, we believe, will challenge these racist practices and develop strategies that strengthen and empower Black families and communities and deliver culturally appropriate responsive services to meet their needs. Again, as a community service provider, I cannot speak how much these kinds of thinking is relevant to the work that we do on the front lines. Thank you again for inviting me to this wonderful and timely process.
Well, all of us as social work students certainly understands all the arguments or any arguments about child welfare. So much appreciated. So now I call on Dr. Wesley Pritchard. He is a Black, queer, intersectional critical race theorist and professor whose work examines the matrices, effects of anti-Black racism and heteronormativity while providing incremental measures to alleviate racial inequities. He teaches at Ontario Tech University with over 20 years of community mobilization, and development. And I can't say enough about how absolutely fabulous Dr. Critchow agreed to be a contributor. When we reached out to him, he did not say no, and really appreciate that you said yes, because this chapter has really contributed to some of the things that we need to be talking about in Africentric social work. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. A lot of noise in the background. I don't know if it's me or somebody else, but it's a lot of noise. I don't want to interrupt, but okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Mullins. And I would like to acknowledge all the editors of this book, Clark, Thomas, Est, and others, and contributors. And thanks to Fernwood, who has been always there to support, I would say, the Black community and cutting-edge critical Canadian work. In addition to my chapter, which I think is, at the time when I asked to present this, to write this chapter, I liked it because it was a challenge in terms of trying to find literature on this subject. So in a lot of ways, this book and the chapter engages in a superior standard of beginning to ask questions around what is missing from an Africentric social work framework, and how do we analytically engage in these complex issues while attempting to remove structural inequalities in theories and practice. And in particular, when we talk about decolonization, what does decolonization mean in the context of a queer body? What does decolonization mean in terms of when we talk about Black queer folks? And I started off the chapter in a way in which made mention to what it means to be a Black queer person, trans person, seeking, looking for any type of mental well-being assistance, and you are there trying to explain this situation to a therapist. I write this book not as a social worker, neither as a therapist, but I also understand the emotional and physical strains that this sort of work brings to bodies like myself for navigating the system in terms of seeking mental health. Unfortunately, I would argue that there aren't many places that Black, queer, LGBTQ folks can go to that would begin to be welcoming and recognizing the complexities and the complex layers that we bring as queer bodies to that situation. So for me, I think when asked to present, to contribute to this chapter, I saw it as a way of conceptualizing mental health disparities, but in particular in ways that begins to speak to the questions of the Black queer body. More so, I was driven to write this because the federal government had recently started to talk about the purge, the gay purge, which is recognition of how federal civil employees were treated back then, and apologies to the federal employees. There was also the recognition of gay marriage already happening in Canada, which I still have issues with, and it's a different discussion. I still don't support to this date. And how all of these movements for queer rights really, what I think, created a pauperization of a Black LGBTQ working class. I think it created more stigmatization and marginalization of Black queer bodies. And so my work was also about how do we begin to get stakeholders and governments when addressing these issues to think intersectionally and to think about race as a central defining feature of gender and sexuality. Most government policies within Canada, where queerness is concerned, we tend to see where whiteness overdetermines queerness and Blackness overdetermines heterosexuality. So there's a lot of work to undo in terms of trying to make sense about what it means to have the health of LGBTQ communities in Canada addressed in ways that are meaningful and engaging, addressing in particular questions around stigma and anti-Black racism, and how stigma impacts health outcomes for different racialized populations that are queer, but in particular in this context, Black. So my work was also about trying to critique the heteronormativity within Africentric thinking that somehow makes the assumption that when we talk about an Africentric social work, we sometimes tend to forget the intersections. And so how are these intersections not taken up? And so I wanted to challenge the heteronormative and hegemonic intersectional convention that gender identity and sexual orientation and race is not salient, and in ways make a contribution to this work so that we can advance empirically this work to begin to critique social work from an integrative rather than an outside status, and to lend an intersectional framework that can begin to ask these questions from an intercategorical perspective and complexify them so that the boundaries of traditionally constructing the queer body as outside will no longer happen. And I hope I have been able to do so with this contribution. As you can see, it's a very infancy stages of its writing. But again, I want to say it opens the door and lends itself to larger conversations. And I want to thank the contributors once again, the editors of this text, the contributors, and Fernwood, and the audience for attending. Thank you so much, Dr. Mullins.
Thank you, Dr. Kuchel. All right. So next, I would like to introduce you to Joanne Forbes, who is a registered social worker and therapist at Women's Health in Women's Hands Community Health Center. Her practice philosophy reaffirms the importance of empowering racialized communities, striving towards cultural humility, addressing the social determinants of health, and witnessing person-centered pathways to healing. So we're very proud to showcase Joanne because she was a student when she started her chapter, and now she's a practicing therapist. She's got fire under her tail as she is walking through the world, right? So it's fabulous that you're here. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mullins, and thank you all for even making this a possibility, making the dream a reality. This chapter was a true collaboration with Dr. Dion Curling and Simone Donaldson, and is a true example of collective wisdom. The title of our chapter is Black Women's Resilience, Therapy and Support for Refugee Women. The goal was initially to develop a text that aims to provide both clinical and advocacy-based interventions to support Black refugee women living with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Our knowledge was based in real-time practice with community members, and it was by us and for us. I myself needed this book throughout my entire social work journey and will definitely need it as of an hour from now. So the section that I will be speaking to is specific to family separation. Family separation to obtain a better life abroad has occurred often within many Black Caribbean cultures, which is commonly described as transnational parenting. Family separation, often leaving children behind, has become a norm for many Jamaicans who seek to obtain a way out of poverty and to safety. When an individual is in constant survival mode as a result of violence and dire poverty in their home country, they will take desperate measures and even make sacrifices like leaving their children behind in hopes to reunite with them again in a much better successful place. Lost in 2013 noted how the West Indian Domestic Scheme, an agreement established in 1955 between the Caribbean governments, specifically Barbados and Jamaica and Canada, essentially forced family separation. Black women were only deemed desirable for this program if they did not have minor age children, were single, were between the ages of 18 and 40 years old, had at least a grade 8 education, and spoke English. While this program was eliminated in 1967, discriminatory immigration policies continued to plague many Caribbean women through the 1970s and beyond. The barbaric legacy of British colonialism also contributed to the discriminatory and anti-Black racist immigration policies, as the worth of Black women was measured solely by their ability to participate in domestic labor. Unaware of transnational parenting, healthcare professionals may see these mothers as selfish, rather than empathizing with their reasons for leaving and the significant hardship associated with separation and reunification. On the contrary, many Black mothers from the Caribbean make meaningful efforts to show up for their children and love their children by supporting them financially, sending a barrel, and writing letters or even finding means to communicate. Missing from this global North narrative is that these women also come from a place where it takes a village to raise a child, which is a serious cultural norm. Furthermore, these women do not leave their children expecting them to survive on their own, as even neighbors become extended chosen family, unlike in Western culture. Afrocentric social workers must understand the reasoning these mothers have for leaving their children back home, rather than viewing this experience from a judgmental manner. However, we should not negate the fact that there are large numbers of children who do feel abandoned by the separation process, making the reunification process difficult for families, especially when parents left them with someone who in the end did not treat them well. So again, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for including our voices into such a powerful text, as our chapter really does combine the clinical aspect, the advocacy aspect, and the impact of colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you. And so the last person for this part of the webinar is Ama Gamboa, and ask her how she cannot get rid of me. Please ask her. She cannot get rid of me. And
I wouldn't want to.
And Amma was also a student when she participated in this book, and this referral came through from Dr. Jennifer Clark as well. So we've had this community relationship with community people, students, and academics. And so Amma is described as a Ghanaian Canadian womanist, therapist, social worker, and a writer, engaged in the field of social work. For the last 8 years, her work has been rooted in supporting Black women, youth, and survivors of gender-based violence. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Mullins, Dr. Clark, Dr. Est, and all of the amazing trailblazers that allowed this book to be possible. This is such a historic moment for so many reasons, and I'm just so grateful that I can be here to share this moment in time with all of you. Okay. So as a social worker, I believe our ability to catalyst Afrocentricity is derived through a lifelong commitment to uncovering, deepening, and practicing African ways of knowing and being. I view decolonizing knowledge historically, culturally, spiritually as essential in this process. Decolonization actively reconnects us to our indigenous ways of knowing, encourages resistance, mobilization, and supports the liberation of African people. As social workers, we must find a unique path to honor ancestral knowledge every day, fostering a direct link to a spiritual, intellectual, physical, and ancestral knowledge and connectedness that propels our social, political, and cultural actions forward. We can promote the paradigm through encouraging agencies to solidify their commitments to African Canadians by utilizing Afrocentricity in organizational practices, principles, and service delivery. Social work education remains critical to our fight for social justice. We must bind a sense of urgency and a call to action towards the Afrocentric paradigm, prioritizing African history and practices through educational curriculums at levels of Canadian education and throughout our communities. Through its adaptation, we would enhance policies that are rooted in the historical and daily experiences of Black communities in Canada. Addressing disparities, policy will also seek to strengthen current systems that actively support and enhance the well-being of African Canadian people. Within this approach, we cultivate a strength-based perspective and policies that can seek to increase funds to support community spaces, organizations, and places of worship that are highly accessed and culturally able to care for the inherent needs of Black communities. In utilizing an Afrocentric framework, we steer away from pathologies of deficit and examine the impact of anti-Black racism. We shift our work and minds, facilitating a new cultural safety for African Canadian people, creating spaces, policies, and institutions that nurture and promote our self-determination, our resistance, and resiliency. Ashe.
All right, so we are opening up the floor for questions for a bit. So if you have some questions to ask any one of us on the panel, feel free to do so, please. Wait, can you, okay, so perhaps I'll try to look at the comments in the, can people speak? Alexandra, do you know?
Unfortunately, attendees cannot speak. They can use the Q&A tab or the chat tab to ask us questions, and then I can feed them to either panelists or whatever you prefer.
Okay, appreciate that. Could you do that, please? Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the first questions actually from the Q&A tab is wondering if it's Afrocentric or Africentric and which is best to use.
Can I ask that Dr. Wanda Bernard Thomas take this question?
Just thinking about that. I hope I'm off mute. Yes, just thinking about that when the question came. Yes, the reality is whether you choose to use Africentric or Afrocentric or African-centered, they essentially all mean the same. We choose to use Africentric in this text, and unless we're using a direct quote, you will see Africentric being used. But if someone chooses to use Afrocentric or African-centered, it means the same. So there's no right or wrong with it unless it's being used in a direct quote.
Excellent, thank you. One of the other questions we have from participants is, first of all, congratulations. Second, what is the ultimate hope for the impact of this book?
I'll just ask anyone on the panel to respond to that. Maybe a few of us can respond, including community people.
Well, I'll respond briefly. I found a lot of the topics were books I was looking for when I was a social work student. I know that's why I wrote my chapter, and that's why I approached my work the way I did. It was a way of knowing that I learned from community that needed to be shared, and I feel that other people who identified as African descent felt the same way.
You're in mute, Emma.
When I started the elective at the Dalhousie School of Social Work in 1999, entitled Africentric Social Work, it was certainly a vision I had that course would be taught in many of the other schools of social work across the country. I didn't think it would take about 30 years for that to happen. And so one of the things I think Sadia mentioned it in her opening remarks from ABSW, we certainly see this text clearly moving Africentric and African-centered social work from the margins, where it has stayed for decades, to the center. So whether that be the center of practice or the center of research or the center of teaching, the center of policy development, we really hope that people take this up in a very serious way.
I think you were trying to say something.
Yes, I don't know if can folks hear me now? Okay, I was just going to say something quite similar to Dr. Wanda Bernard, and just recognizing the deep impacts that colonialism has had on social work. So by us having a solidified, way of really being able to validate the experiences and the historical knowledge of African people, but also our strengths in a way that doesn't dehumanize us, and sees us at the center, I think it will, especially, as I wrote this as a student, I can only imagine how it will begin to hopefully shift the field of social work and what happens to African people and Black people when they enter into social work spaces or to community organizations and are looking for care and support.
Mm-hmm.
There is a bit of a lag on the platform, so I just want to make sure I'm not cutting anyone off. If I am, please just cut me off. But I do have another question, if we are ready. One of the questions, I think it's a little bit in terms of advocacy, and it's how do we ensure, as individuals who attended this presentation, as individuals who have purchased the text, as individuals who work in spaces such as my own or other associations, how do we make sure that this book will be a required reading for all social workers?
I'll probably just start with that one. So social work, we're at a crossroads. We have lots of statements from schools of social work. We have the national and provincial bodies of social work making statements and having meetings about anti-Black racism and so on and so forth. So we don't think it is our job to ensure that the social work profession, including practice and education, pick this book up. It's just got out, but CASW has done a great job in publicizing it. It's out there, so anybody who wants to use it can use it. And so we are wanting to see the statements and the meetings that people have been doing for the last little while be put into action by using this text as a required required course content, and also in practice as well. Practitioners need to use it because there are pieces in there that speaks to the need for having specific information that is Afrocentric focus in the field area. So that's where I'm sitting with that, is that it's incumbent on the social work profession to do the work. We have actually done the most important piece by presenting the information to you. So take it and run.
I'd also like to echo the importance of, as what Dr. Mullins mentioned, that this has already been created. The hardest part was coming together, putting our minds together, putting our histories of trauma, love, wisdom, generational trauma, all into an accessible piece. And I feel that as a practitioner who was a student, these voices were definitely missing. So to make something required, I feel like is a different question from this is already in itself intrinsically required.
Mm.
Absolutely. And I mean, if anyone is on here who attends any of the webinars that we host at CISW, I always say, we have two jobs as social workers: one, to provide immediate services, and two, to advocate for long-term societal or systemic change. So one of your jobs is, thank you so much for attending. This is a great first step. How are you going to incorporate this text into your work or into your school or into your classes and continue this conversation forward? These recordings are available on demand, so you're able to share it with your peers, with your colleagues, and we are giving you a 20% off code for the book. Thank you to Fernwood Publishing. So really, all of the tools are in that tool belt. We are coming up on close to the end of the time, which is unfortunate. I wish we could have all afternoon to discuss this, but I will throw one more question out to the group before I pass it over to wrap it up. The final question, and I do really appreciate this question. I appreciate all your questions. Sorry if we didn't get to them. But is there any way we could speak to the experience of intergenerational collaboration in this project and the role of such collaborations in advancing these issues that we addressed in this book, to any of the panelists?
I'd like to speak, but I'd like for one of the elders to speak first on this, please.
So that's a great question. And I think that this book is an excellent example of multiple generations coming together and putting this volume together. As was mentioned in the initial comments by the representative from ABSW, Dr. Mullins, Dr. Bernard, and I presented at the 2014 conference. And it's taken us 7 years, but we persevered. But we've came to the decision that it was important to have a very diverse cross-section of individuals who would be contributors to this book. And one of them is across generations, because we come from the viewpoint that no matter where we are in terms of our life cycle, our learning doesn't stop. And so as someone who's been around a long time, I'm not going to say I'm old, I think it's important for someone like myself to work with younger colleagues, whether they be academics, community-based people, because my 4 colleagues who put this book together were all rooted in terms of academics, but we're also part of different African Canadian communities. And in the first chapter, each of us shares a little bit about our experience of being students in Canadian social work education programs. And I could say without any reservations that when the 4 of us were going through our various social work programs, there was virtually nothing about people of African descent. And so I think it's great having different individuals at different stages in the life cycle contribute to this book, because nobody has a monopoly on knowledge. Nobody has a monopoly on experience. And I think one of the things that we try to do in this book is to be very respectful of the different lived experiences that each of the contributors and authors brought to this project.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to say, for me in this process, the mentorship, the intergenerational mentorship is ongoing. So even to organizing this book launch, which I've never done before, I reached out to Dr. Thomas Bernard. It was the intergenerational workings and connections remains in place. It was quite intense. We had different kinds of conversations. We did different activities together. We divided up the work in different ways. We had life circumstances that changed, but we knew that as a group of Black academics or Black people who were very committed to AASW's vision of this book, that we didn't have a choice to, follow the bloodline of our ancestors who, their dreams are, echoed in our hearts and they're whispered in our ears. So we followed those lines in terms of, we've got two elders here. I mean, Dr. Est is now retired. Can you ask him how long he's been at this? Senator Bernard Thomas is talking about used to be a social worker. Who are we kidding? She was doing social work through this entire project. Myself and Dr. Clark also did that with editors in terms of helping to shape and form work, conflict resolution, all those kinds of things. We're not suggesting that this was a cakewalk and that, we're all, flying on fairy dust or whatever, but we did our ancestors proud by the way that we supported each other, how we got mentorship from our elders, how we got knowledge that we can pass on to the next generation, and how the mentorship continues today. And that's my biggest takeaway, is that we did this in spite of, not because of. And I'm very grateful for, the kind of camaraderie that we built, and what we survived through the time. I know that was a bit of a long thing, but I just needed to say that because Senator Bernard will not say that, for example, that I call her up for everything.
Yeah.
I have to say a little something. We talk about multi-generational trauma. We don't say enough about multi-generational resilience. And I would say that in this project, we certainly saw that multi-generational resilience. And the fact that we all hung in there with this project, and for both Dr. Est and myself, one of the things that we were deeply committed to was that mentorship of the next generation of academics, and trying to do that while dealing with so many different competing challenges. But hopefully the end result will be, well, I won't say that. Let me change that. The end result is truly a project that we can be and that we are very proud of. And I certainly want to say to you, Dolores and Jennifer, Dr. Clark, you did a lot of the heavy lifting, especially in the final stages, as Dr. Est was saying. So we thank you and commend you for that. And one more thing I'll say, I'm not sure, we don't see the list of participants, so I don't know if there's anyone on the line from CASWE or from the Board of Deans and Directors. But this is where we need allies to step up, because they are the folks who will help move this along in terms of it being available across the country in various schools of social work. And CASW can be our ally in helping to ensure that those organizations take this and run with it. It is not our job to do that, but as allies, we need you doing that. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today as well.
Yes, definitely. I would echo that call wholeheartedly. Before we wrap up here, I just wanted to give anyone an opportunity to say any kind of final remarks before we close. We will be having this be available in a couple hours on the same link, as well as downloading a version and potentially putting it on YouTube. So check in for both those options. But to wrap up, any final closing words from anyone, please take it away.
I have some closing remarks. I was going to read the poetry, but I'll just do the closing remarks just in the interest of time. So we encourage you to get the book and to tell everyone about the book. we believe that this book is relevant to social work, but it's also relevant to people who are working with people of African descent. So in youth care or in nursing homes or in churches, wherever you're doing services, anyone who's doing service to and for Black people, it's relevant there. This book will help you to expand your knowledge and understanding about how to work with people of African descent from childhood to elderhood. And it gives you some specific practice pieces as well as some educational pieces and some historical pieces that you can lean on, at least in the beginning. This is the first of its kind, as we know in Canada. It's only one book. It cannot do every single thing. Please also remember that this book is not meant to squeeze people of African descent into a corner where you are trying to apply the knowledge that you're learning in the book to every single person. Very important that we understand that it doesn't work for every single Black person. These are principles that we've offered of a potential way that you can do practice, that you can practice with and work with people of African descent. We also, in closing, we also want to send a special thank you to Fernwood, Wayne especially, and his team for working so diligently with us to get this first volume out. And as we say in our epilogue, this is the first one, but this is not the end. So stay tuned. And blessings to you on your journey of discovering Africentric social work, or working with people of African descent through an Africentric lens. Thank you.
So much to our panelists, the Association of Black Social Workers, to everyone who has attended. Just another massive thank you. Before we sign off, is there any final words from anyone else, or are we good to end here? Okay. Well, we will see you all at the next webcast, and just a thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your lovely day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Thank you.
panelists.